The 2020 campaign for Indiana governor has been overtaken by concerns about the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and nationwide protest over racial injustice and police violence. Those issues have made for a tighter race than expected as incumbent Eric Holcomb, a Republican, tries to fend off challenges from Democrat Woody Myers and Libertarian Ronald Rainwater. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith spoke with each of the three candidates about the race's big issues. Hi, Brandon.
Hey there, Joe. So Republican Governor Eric Holcomb is running for his second term in office after he replaced Mike Pence on the gubernatorial ticket 4 years ago. Naturally, as you said, our conversation centered on the coronavirus pandemic and the state's response. Well, Governor, thanks so much for sitting down. I want to start with the thing that's dominated all of our lives for the last 6 months, which I'm sure you can guess is COVID-19. Looking back over the last 6 months then, is there any changes you would make? What would you change about the state's response to the pandemic?
Well, I certainly wouldn't change how proud I am of the way that three different sectors all came together in a real quickness and focus. And that is the nonprofit sector, the private sector, and the government sectors. And I'm not just talking about the state government, I'm talking about local governments as well. And so we're in a place where we can continue to manage our way through this. You know, we didn't ever shut down completely. A lot of people say you shut down. Well, I mean, there was a lot of business going on. And so when you balance the lives, first and foremost, safety first, and the livelihoods, we're proving you can go back to school. We're proving you can go back to work.
There's been criticism of the way you've spent the CARES Act money. Why are we sitting on so much of that money?
Well, we're being fiscally prudent about when we actually, not just as you point out, allocate, but actually spend. We're going to spend this, the allocation that we've been given through the CARES dollars from our federal partners. We won't leave money sitting on the table. But look, I took equal criticism for not spending down the rainy day fund and not spending down our reserves. And folks said it was raining then. Thank goodness that we had those reserves to be able to bridge our way to the other side. And we're looking at where are the needs right now.
On to the other thing that's dominated headlines the last few months, which is racial inequity and protests around police shootings of black men and women and things like that. You announced a series of steps that you want to see the state government take, as well as potentially into the future on this issue. Do Hoosiers of color in particular have a reason to be skeptical that things will change?
Well, maybe to date, but hopefully not going forward because of the actions that we're taking and going to continue to take. After Mr. Floyd's death, it was crystallized in my mind that we have to do something different than just have those programs out there. And if there are barriers in my house, in the state house, in the state government, then we need to make sure that we're removing those barriers and getting rid of those hurdles. And what it comes down to in my mind is empowerment. How are we going to empower people to better determine their own destinies?
I want to talk about education. Always an important issue for a gubernatorial campaign, but more important perhaps than ever because we no longer have we will no longer have an elected state superintendent. So when it comes to that decision, the first ever appointment for a state superintendent that you might have if you're reelected, what are the qualifications? What are you looking for in that person?
Fluent in the area of education from the whole complete pathway of a student's life. So they have that experience. The same thing I'm looking for in every agency head, quite frankly. Someone who's honest, someone who's humble, and someone who's hungry.
Teacher pay. Teachers, the vast majority of teachers in Indiana got a raise from the last state budget, we know, from the IRB data, but it still doesn't get us to where we'd like to be because we started from behind. You have the Teacher Compensation Commission that was working on developing long-term solutions. Is that sort of the long-term solution for really paying our teachers what they deserve kind of off the table in the short term because of the pandemic and the economic struggles that have come with it?
No. I want it to be higher, as you point out. I've been very vocal about that. That's where this long-term, how do we sustain paying our teachers what they are worth and what we expect of them. And that's where they're looking at. And yes, COVID affected that, but it's not going to derail anything.
Well, next up is Dr. Woody Myers, the Democratic candidate for governor. Now, Myers has one of the most compelling profiles you could ask for in this particular election year. He is a medical doctor, a former state health commissioner, and the first black person to run for governor on a major party ticket in this state's history. And yet, at the same time, Myers, in part because of limitations caused by the pandemic, has struggled to gain traction in this race and is considered an underdog. So let's talk about those issues that have dominated the headlines so much this year, the first, of course, being COVID-19. What would you have done differently if you were running the state than what has been done so far here in Indiana?
Oh, so much. I wouldn't have followed Mike Pence's lead, for one thing, or Donald Trump's lead. And now we know that both of them have lied to the country repeatedly. There's the tapes to prove it. I know that we should have done our testing program far earlier, far more aggressively. A number of governors were very aggressive in bringing PPE supplies together for the folks in their states, and they were far more successful than we were. Now we see that in our nursing homes, for instance, the cost of a dollar's worth of PPE 6 months ago is $6 to $10 now, and that has been because we did not aggregate our purchasing power. We did not have an inventory in place. That's something I would absolutely have done. We moved the stages along too quickly. In addition to that, we don't even today have really a mask mandate in Indiana. We have a mask suggestion. And it's just my view that what was absent from the beginning was true leadership.
So Governor has been criticized, particularly recently, for how much money from the Federal CARES Act, the COVID relief dollars, are still unspent in Indiana.
Right.
Is it prudent for the governor to at least wait on some of this money to see what more comes out of the federal government?
And how many people will die during that wait? And how many more people will get infected during that wait? The answer is no. You use the funds that you have now, and if the federal government is guilty of not providing complete and adequate instruction, so you ask later for forgiveness.
I want to talk about the other issue that has dominated our conversation our national conversation, our state conversation the last several months, which is racial injustice. We've seen some steps that Governor Holcomb announced in recent weeks, the hiring of a cabin officer, reviewing all of the training that goes on at the police academy here in Indiana. Is it a good first step?
If that's truly in his heart, if that's truly what he believes, then he could have done it 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, when he first took office, or he could have encouraged his previous boss, Mike Pence, to do it. You know, Brandon, we've got now almost 16 years of leadership in the State House by a Republican governor, and here it is 60, 70 days before an election, that this is now an important issue. I'm not going to need a special officer to look over the work of everybody else and then report on how everybody else is doing. I'm going to hire people from the beginning who know how important diversity is, who know how important inclusion is.
Let's talk about education. Always an important issue, of course, in an Indiana governor's race. It's more than half of the state budget. But perhaps more important than it's ever been because there is no longer an elected state superintendent of public instruction. You would be the first governor, if elected, to appoint that role. What are you looking for in that person? What kind of qualifications are you looking for?
Somebody who's a true leader, somebody who knows how to communicate with the public, communicate with teachers, someone who the teachers trust, someone who has an intimate knowledge of how school systems work today and how they could work better, but someone also who's willing to question how we are doing our work today and whether or not there are better ways to do it in the future.
Indiana's been looking at studying teacher pay here for a few years now. We know that we are doing poorly as it relates to our neighboring states and states across the country.
Right.
Because of the budget challenges that Indiana, like so many other states, will be facing for the next few years, are teachers just going to have to wait a little longer for those long-term solutions?
Not for me, they're not. We're going to find the money to pay the teachers of the state of Indiana what they deserve. They are the future of our state. We will go through that state budget with a fine-tooth comb. We will make every change required in order to make sure that our teachers get what they deserve.
Well, and finally, Donald Rainwater is the Libertarian candidate for governor, and he's looking to make some history this year. Third-party candidates rarely make much of an impact in an Indiana gubernatorial race. No Libertarian, for instance, has ever gotten more than 3.5% of the vote. But Rainwater is tapping into conservative frustration with the governor's COVID response, and some polls show him breaking double digits, which could have a huge impact on the incumbent. As a Libertarian, what do you see as the role of government in addressing the pandemic?
Provide the citizens with the information necessary to decide for ourselves how best to safeguard our lives and the lives of our families. I believe that all too often, the idea that government can protect everyone is misguided.
What about the Governor Holcomb's response hasn't worked in your mind? The number of cases, as it relates to the number of tests, has come down in recent months. So it seems he touts those numbers, says it's clear the response is working. What about it didn't work for you?
Many, almost 1 million Hoosiers have had to file unemployment claims since the first week of March. We have no idea what the economic ripple impact of the executive orders will be from now over the next couple of years.
The money that's come from the federal government, primarily by way of the CARES Act, intended for COVID relief. Indiana's still sitting on $1.3 billion of that $2.4 billion we've gotten.
And many of the folks who are still unemployed haven't got unemployment checks because our unemployment insurance system is antiquated. We're not helping those who were displaced economically by the governor's unilateral executive orders.
If you're governor of Indiana, as you see the problem of racial injustice, not just in government, but in society in general, what then is the role for government to help address that crisis?
Much of the what we'll call racial injustice has been government overreach. Here again, whether it was to oppress someone or to attempt to make up for past bad acts, and it doesn't work. You can't use government to fix something that really can't be fixed.
What role do you see for that and for police reform?
We need to have an honest, straightforward discussion about holding individuals accountable for individuals' actions. And I don't think we do that today. I think we all too often want to blame a group of people for one person's bad actions. I'm a proponent for body cams. I think it protects both the officer and the citizen. I believe that we need to do better training.
So education is always a big deal in an Indiana governor's race. The governor will now appoint the state superintendent of public instruction for the first time, as well, instead of that position being elected. If you're hiring that state superintendent, what qualifications are you looking for?
Well, I'm looking for someone, first of all, who has not only been involved in public education, but someone who also has experience and knowledge and open-mindedness toward educational choice in Indiana. I believe we unfortunately politicize education entirely too much in the state of Indiana. And we need to focus on making sure that the dollars that Hoosier taxpayers pay for education get to the kids in the classrooms.
All righty, Brandon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.